Hi, I'm Owen, and this is my coding and scripting for games assignment video. Next up is a short 2-minute clip of how the game turned out. So as you can see, for my artifact I chose to do a puzzle platformer with a unique twist. The character can be cloned and morph into different shapes. I chose this as I felt it'd be a good challenge for me. One area where I felt I improved the efficiency of the game data was I was originally using an integer for the scores, and based on how much score you had, you'd be able to spawn your clone. But one of the problems I faced with that was that when I tried to implement that with the UI, it would instantly fill up the UI bar because the UI is based on a float. So I realized that I had to change my score game data from an integer into a float, and by doing that, the UI was then able to function as intended. Another way I improved the efficiency of code in terms of game logic was the way I was using morph targets originally was by typing in the name of the morph target for each piece of code. This would make the code extremely long, as I would have to reference the code manually each time. So one of the ways that I fixed this was by using an array to store the names and to call those names once a key binding was pressed. This cut down the code significantly, making it more streamlined and making it easier to follow the logic at hand. This also helped me prevent bugs from happening, as I was able to check which morph target was being activated by debugging it whilst testing. This also future-proofs the code, as I was able to add more names to the array, meaning any morph targets I added in the future could be easily integrated into the code. Here's some problems I came across and how I problem solved. So one of the problems that occurred was whenever you gained enough points, I made it so you were able to spawn a clone of yourself. The only issue is once you spawned that clone, there was no collision on it. And I wanted to make it so that you were able to actually jump on top of your clones once they spawned. But after implementing that, I realized that once I spawned the clone, you instantly got stuck. So a way I solved that was by doing a collision check, essentially checking whether or not the player was still inside the object once it was spawned, and if it was, to turn the collision off. And the moment the player left the collision would turn back on. This meant that the clones now had collision and the player was able to interact with them. The second problem I had to solve was after collecting enough points, you were able to spawn those clones. The only issue was there was no cap, so you were able to spam the spawn key and you could spawn as many clones as you liked. This meant you could do things like stack clones on top of each other to get outside the level. So the way I fixed that was I made it so that whenever you spawned a clone, it had a point cost. So once the clone was spawned, it would minus the cost at the end of the code, which meant you could no longer spam clones in and out of the world. Another problem I came across was you could jump and spawn the clones in the air and they would stay there. So to fix this, I added physics that was enabled in the code after the player was outside of the collision. This worked as it brung the clones back down onto the plane. The only issue was they were now able to be knocked over. So the way I fixed this was I made it so that only the Z-axis would acknowledge the physics system and all other axes would ignore it. This meant that the clones couldn't be knocked over. In terms of professional practices that I integrated, a good example of this would be how I used the Unreal Engine 5 documentation to look at how naming conventions are used in the industry. This helped me keep the naming conventions so that if the project was passed on to somebody else, the prefixes for the type of actor or blueprint would be the same, and they would know which blueprint or type of asset is based on the prefix. So that's something that I tried to integrate throughout the project. I also made sure to comment on my blueprint scripts. This is so that if the project was passed on to somebody else, they could read the comments and understand what the code was doing, so that the person who took up the project wouldn't have to go through the code and figure out what exactly I was trying to do. I feel that this makes the project easier for someone else to pick up and more professional. I also feel, as a game artist, now that I know how to implement things such as my models and how to import things like animation and morph targets and how to implement these into Unreal Engine, I feel it makes me a more competent team member in the future, as they can rely on me to do things such as importing models and making sure things are working like the normals and morph targets, as well as scale. In terms of technical understanding and some technical demonstration, I feel I used a good amount of game data, such as like variables, booleans, floats, arrays, integers. I felt I used these well, and I felt I used them in the correct places. And in places where I felt that they were used wrong, I was able to quickly change them and make sure I was using the right ones, like I demonstrated earlier in the video with the score. I also feel that my game logic was used well and code isn't too messy, and tried not to use things like event tick as much as possible. I perhaps could have used the input system that comes with Unreal, but I found it hard to use, so I stuck with the key presses, so I felt I could have improved that. But other than that, I feel like the code is relatively easy to read through and to understand. Overall, throughout this artifact, I feel I used a good amount of game data and game logic. There's certainly places where I could improve, and felt I should have used some more advanced techniques such as for loops and while loops. But overall, I'm really happy with the way my artifact turned out. So in terms of performance throughout the year, I felt like I attended the CSGO workshops as much as I could. However, due to all the game jams, I found it hard to make time to come along to these and to make the content for those game jams. Although that being said, throughout the year, a lot of the times during the game jams, regardless of being a game artist, I found myself using blueprints and creating my own blueprint code. Because of this, I actually learnt so much about Unreal and the blueprints. So despite the fact I may have missed some of the lectures, the game jams actually sort of supplemented that just by doing them. I also attended as many of the online lectures as possible and found these really helpful, especially as I didn't understand variables or game data at all when I started, and I felt that I now understand this. This is proven by my overall grade that I received for my exam. I scored highly in my exam, which I was really proud of, as I find coding really hard. But yeah, overall, throughout the year, I feel like I have done really well, and I'm happy with the progress I've made. And I feel like I'm able to create my own indie games now based on the knowledge I've learned throughout this CSGO course. So despite not making up the 200 hours, really happy with what I have achieved.